We are not yet gaveled down for the 186th convention of the Diocese of Indianapolis, but we are certainly on our way. So welcome to this day of workshops and feasting and fellowship and learning. If you are here for the first time, I'm Bishop Jennifer Baskerville-Burroughs, and it is my honor and joy to be Bishop of this diocese and to be gathering in this way, in this place. As we begin this first workshop, I want to start, because this is the first words I'll get to say today, I want to start by thanking St. Paul's Episcopal Church for their incredible, outstanding hospitality to host us this weekend. Can we start with a round of applause for St. Paul's? I will say from the rector, John Denson, who said yes, gave us the go-ahead to even begin to dream that we would host convention here, all the way to the lay volunteers who greeted you at the door and who have made it possible for us to be here. Just enormous gratitude. Now, I'm not going to talk long because we are here not to hear me today. You'll hear enough from me tomorrow. But this is an opportunity for our first workshop to be done all together with our plenary speaker, Cole Arthur Riley. And so I want to say a few words about her before she comes up and leads us. I am sure that if you're here, you probably already know who she is. But just as a reminder, she is an author and poet and what I would call a spiritual sage for this time in our life as a country, in the world. A deep spiritual sage for those of deep faith and those who are seeking to connect with God in a language that is both ancient and liberationist and contemporary. She's the author of the book This Here Flesh and is the creator of the Black Liturgies Instagram account, which has been a source of spiritual sustenance since 2020. And I'll say that she is a Black woman who is writing out of her experience, centering the voices and traditions of Black and brown people, and doing it in a way that it is so resonant, not only with people of color, but with people from every background, no matter what their race, their socioeconomic status, their faith tradition. The words that she shares and the way that she shares them hits home. Cole Arthur Riley hails from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, now lives in Ithaca, New York, and as we spoke yesterday, I'll say that she lives in a house that was built during the time that Jackson Kemper was running around Indiana planting churches. So an old home. She is one of the most sought-after speakers and voices of wisdom of our time, and I could not be more delighted that she has made time to be with us this weekend to lead this workshop, to address us in plenary tomorrow. And so without further ado, Ms. Cole Arthur Riley.
Thank you, and hello. Thanks for being with me in this space and with each other. It's a beautiful space. This is a wonderful kind of welcome into your community. I'm going to talk about liberation, liberating one's interior world in terms of emotion, but also liberating our stories and doing some emotional truth-telling. I always try to remind people when we're in situations like this that do what you need, do what your body needs to survive. You know, if you need to close your eyes, if you need to lean back in your seat, if you need to walk around, I will not be threatened by this. I welcome it. Always is a good reminder for me when I'm in your seats that I retain agency over my body. So do what you need. And we're going to talk about liberating our interior worlds. So what it means to be so acquainted with your inner life that when you encounter something in conflict, in dissonance, a space that is a threat to your true self, that you can name that with the care and urgency it demands. I may speak of contemplation and mysticism. There are many beautiful definitions of contemplation, but if I had to put it into words, I would say It's a commitment to paying attention to the divine in all things, in one's interior world and as well as the conditions of life and the world around us. And mysticism, I think, is a kind of fidelity to magic and mystery in our interpretation of those worlds. So this is our question. How can nearness to our inner self in all its magic and mystery serve as an active liberation practice? And to answer that, we're going to talk about locating the true self, emotional liberation, and collective memory. Again, I'm Cole. I'm a writer and a poet. As Bishop Jennifer said, I live in a very old home and in upstate New York, Ithaca, New York. But I'm originally born and for the most part raised in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I come from a very excitable, very funny family of extroverts. They're really energetic, communicative, expressive. My grandma used to say, "We Arthurs are nothing if not sound." Nothing if not sound. And she would say, if we were all kind of in a store together, she could pinpoint where each of us were because everyone was just so loud. But also, big and charming and good with people. And then I came along. So out comes this quiet soul of a child. When I was young, I wasn't very verbal. I actually had something called selective mutism, which, if you don't know, it's a anxiety condition most commonly found in children, but it can kind of persist into adulthood, where in the presence of people, a child will feel kind of incapable of speech. And even as I kind of grew out of that disorder, as my anxiety took on new forms, I still remained a very, very quiet child. There are many family stories or even family videos, if you were to watch an Arthur family video, of everyone kind of in the kitchen, laughing, dancing, and then it would not be unusual for the camera to pan to like 6 or 7-year-old Cole, just by herself, staring out of a window, kind of longingly. So very quiet, pretty sad as well, emotionally robust child, and very near to my interior world. But my silence and my sadness and my connection to my interior world really was, for me, one of the earliest forms of alienation that I experienced. When you're a child, the things that make you distinct are some of our earliest portals to shame. And I was near to myself, but so distant from those I loved and needed to be loved by. So it's been this kind of slow-going journey back to discern what of me is really true and what of me has been dismissed or neglected in order to numb some of that shame. And along the way, I've been kind of excavating and recovering some really queer and beautiful fragments from my childhood. I've been writing a lot about my childhood self and how my sister and we would take all the expired condiments from our fridge and take them into our basement and mix potions and cast spells, fully believing in our little black magic selves. And in my book, This Year Flesh, I write about this friend who I call Boo and these recess ceremonies we would have where we'd go to the fields and eat icing and talk to the clouds. And so I was a child of mysticism and ritual, I think, a little bit of a monastic in me. But I'll be honest, I didn't have a lot of friends. And like I said, I love my family, but I didn't feel a sense of belonging in my family. And a profound loneliness was born in me until I eventually grew to kind of resent these things and kind of abandon these things in myself, not just the mystical or, how I communicated with the world, but I abandoned my sense of self. And like many shy children, I retreated into kind of books and knowledge and the life of the mind in order to shield me from the pain of alienation and rejection. It's very common. So I retreated into my mind, but I emptied it of all magic. So fast forward to college, and this was the first time I really found myself consistently in predominantly white spaces, apart from dance classes. But this was the first time, this very white intellectual space, and I really began to practice shape-shifting. People say all the time, you go to college to find yourself, you choose who you want to be. And so I did. I did what I could to morph into a version of me that would be palatable to whiteness. I learned to be sarcastic and speak a bit quicker. And I pretended to care a great deal about the theologies of dead white men who really hated me, actually, and my blackness. But I began to construct myself. And what I wish I knew then was that claiming one's true self, liberating one's true self, is not a matter of choosing. It's a matter of listening. I want you to hear this from Howard Thurman. I suspect some of it being the people you are, I suspect some of you have heard it before. He spoke these words at a Spelman College commencement ceremony, and the speech has kind of come to be known as the sound of the genuine. But receive it again. There is something in every one of you that waits, listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. And if you cannot hear it, you will never find whatever it is for which you are searching. And if you hear it and then do not follow it, it was better that you had never been born. And if you cannot hear the sound of the genuine in you, you will all your life spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. He says there is in you something that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. And sometimes there is so much traffic going on in your minds, so many different kinds of signals, so many vast impulses floating through your organism that go back thousands of generations, long before you were even a thought in the mind of creation. And he says, you are buffeted by these. And in the midst of all of this, you've got to find out what your name is. Who are you? How does the sound of the genuine come through to you? Now, depending on your Christian formation, you might have absorbed, a lot of rhetoric that makes sentiments like Thurman stir some tension in you. Many of us have been taught that this kind of listening to the self is dangerous. That our focus should be on God and God alone. We've learned to be very distrustful of the self. The heart is deceitful among all things, which I think has really been wielded against us to really distract us from and turn us against our interior lives in unhelpful ways. But I think we have a lot of evidence in Scripture and otherwise that attunement to the self is both a form of liberation as well as a form of revelation about God and the divine. I think what Thurman is getting at here is that there is maybe a spiritual and a moral imperative to locate one's true self. It's an anti-delusion practice, A lot of writers write about true self, false self. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think at its root, so much of this is entangled with not just survival, but self-hatred. So Thomas Merton talks about, the true self and the false self, and he said, every one of us is shadowed by an illusory person, a false self. And he says, we're not very good at recognizing illusions, least of all the ones we cherish about ourselves. And he says there's an irreducible opposition between the deep transcendent self that awakens only in contemplation and the superficial false self which we commonly identify with. I think there's something to this. Our false self, or our deceitful heart, if you want to use that language, I think is something we can be rightfully suspicious of, but not at the expense of finding out what then is actually true of us. The answer to the false self is not a rejection of our inner worlds, but an embrace and a listening. Now, there's much to be said about how we construct our false selves. Some of us desire belonging, some praise, some power, some victimhood, or maybe the truer thing under victimhood would be absolution, and some of us even safety. What does this have to do with liberation? If you listened closely to the passage from Thurman's address, you heard him say, if you do not locate the sound of the genuine in you, you will spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. Well, who's pulling the strings? Those metaphorical strings have everything to do with how injustice and indignity is perpetuated in the world. When you are poorly attuned to yourself and the stories that have made you, how will you notice what compels you to say vote for a particular candidate or advocate for particular policies or confess or not confess? If I am to survive, I need you to become unflinchingly honest with yourself, about who you are, what has made you, what stories live in you. I don't benefit from your false self. I don't need your bondage. If I'm going to be free, I need you to be free, right? And those strings are chains. When an 18-year-old black girl in a room of white faces starts talking about the brilliance of Abraham Kuyper, which, if you don't know, spoiler alert, he was just a raging and unapologetic racist. He wasn't all that brilliant. But when an 18-year-old black girl does that in a room like this, it's because her belonging is at stake. When the girl who used to mix potions in the basement says she only believes in what she sees, it's because she's too exhausted to dream. So as we excavate our inner worlds, it's not an exercise in narcissism, but actually liberation. Which is to say, you were not meant to live underneath the weight of a mask. And there are all kinds of reasons for its existence, and I won't criticize you for them. But any love you receive while Mass is only love that's kept from your true self, your true face. And it only affirms the lie that unmasked you are unlovable. And do you know the kinds of things people do when they believe themselves to be unlovable? Do you know? They exalt themselves by diminishing the dignity of others. It's all relative when you're hurting. So I'll make you small so I don't feel as small. If I have to wear the mask, you have to carry the weight of the mask. So how do we reclaim and liberate our true self, ourselves? Because once you start making your false self appear real, with these trappings, the way you dress, the books you read, the way you speak, it becomes very difficult to then start to rend real from unreal, to remember the true self, to just call upon her. It takes time, and it's a rewiring. And I think this is what Thurman knew so acutely, that we will not become real apart from a deep and habitual listening. And I say habitual because I'm not actually convinced how much of our true self is actually static. I think it's a process of listening and re-listening. What am I listening for? I'm listening for loves, fears, hungers, dreams. I'm listening for loves, fears, hungers, dreams. And I think I get there through emotional truth-telling, embodied listening, and keeping memory of the stories that have formed me. We're going to talk about the embodied listening part of this in the plenary tomorrow. But let's talk about kind of one of these interior encounters, which is emotional truth-telling. So I'm 6, and me, my father, my sister, my brother, my stepmom, we're all crammed into this car on our way home from Red Lobster. And this is just a fragment of a memory, really, but in the memory, my father is looking back at me over his shoulder, and he's just going, "Why are you crying? Nicole, what are you crying for?" And I'm just saying, I don't know. And in the memory, I see his face, and it feels very much so like a rebuke. But I now know it was a kind of desperation in him. So I've been doing a lot of interviews the past few years with my father and grandma, as well as other elders, but my book is based on my grandma and my father and those conversations. But my father, in one of our conversations, I'm telling him this memory, knowing I may write about it, and he admits that it was never that he was angry that I was sad, but it was that my sadness felt like a locked door. He said it felt like my sadness was shutting a door. Very young dad, by the way. He had my sister when he was 17, me when he was 19, single dad of 2 little girls, and he hadn't quite learned how to encounter his own sadness in his own interior world in a meaningful way. So when he was confronted with that, and his little girl, it created this alienating force for him. Defense went up. And I thought, isn't that something? Because I then grew up to be a severely emotionally repressed adult. I've not maintained the emotional range of my childhood, sadly. Emotional repression can happen if you've grown up in an environment where you weren't given much space to experience and express emotions. You may have been raised by primary caregivers who didn't really display negative emotions themselves, or kind of had family mantras like, get on with it, stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about, even be grateful, don't be silly, everything's fine, these kind of mantras. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you maybe had a parent who was entirely unable to regulate their emotions in a healthy way, to the point where maybe you had to parent your parent. Children in that situation can grow up to be emotionally repressed or emotionally constricted adults, and might avoid emotions out of a sense of kind of authority or maturation. Traumatic experiences can result in this. We know this. A child whose needs were ignored or neglected, or who was criticized or punished for displaying or expressing feelings. Thank you. And with emotional repression and constriction, it's complicated, because I think a lot of us hear this and we think it's apathy. And that's what I thought. And I thought, I'm not apathetic. I've cried, every once in a while, but it's actually not apathy. Inside, one can be quite angry or sad, but it's actually the inability to express that emotion, or the inability to recognize that emotion in oneself. It's very common in racial PTSD and other forms of PTSD, by the way. And I'll say this, it's even more complicated because in the case of emotional repression, you can end up kind of growing to mirror the emotions of others. But the thing is, you're not experiencing them yourself. It's more of a way to be socially accepted. It's not a practice of actual attunement. So for me, it was as if a emotion was coming to me from outside and just kind of resting on my skin, or as opposed to originating from within me and emanating out. And I think there's a difference. Why am I saying this? I think emotional repression and constriction are really strategic tools of oppressive powers. If you are reduced to, positive affect, if you're less capable of sensing pain and injustice, who does that benefit? And on the occasion you do sense it, the powers that be can kind of wield this established emotional hierarchy against you and tell you to calm down and be grateful. Oppressed peoples, which is many of us, I think have a calling to resist the formation of emotional repression or emotional constriction. Now, people who benefit from oppression, which is also many of us, have the same calling, but I think with different reason. I think those who identify as oppressor possess inner worlds that are in fact plagued by guilt. I think this is any oppressor's primary tormentor, so its only hope of being able to look at itself, of continuing on in the world, or as James Baldwin says, its only hope of confronting the tyranny of the mirror, is this emotional repression or distancing. I think this is very true of whiteness, and when I say whiteness, I'm not referring to people who just happen to exist in particular bodies. I'm talking about a force, a deep-rooted and sociological force. But I think whiteness relies a lot on emotional constriction to carry out its deeds. This is how it survives, and I hope it's not too jolting to hear, but it's emotional repression, emotional distancing that allowed white men and white women and little white children to put on their Sunday's best and watch black bodies swing dead from trees, or tear black babies from their mothers on an auction block. I'm not trying to be dramatic, actually. I'm saying this because this emotional repression is ingrained deeply. It's intergenerational. Deeply ingrained emotional distancing, and emotional dishonesty. It's a delusion that runs deep. And so when we commit our interior lives to emotional truth-telling, I think we're slowly dismantling the delusions we've inherited. It's a powerful liberation practice. I'll talk a little bit about lament. It's just one form of emotional truth-telling. But I'll take this example, just times being what they are in the world around us. There's a lot of grief in many of our bodies, I'm sure, today. There can be an aversion to lament in Christian spaces, but I actually find that in progressive circles, lament is kind of really in right now. It's like the thing. And I think that's kind of true of the Episcopal Church. Whether or not we always practice it with sincerity or with depth, I'm not always sure. I'm not convinced. I think sometimes we just kind of say, weep with those who weep, and we feel sad and think we've done it. But I think true lament is actually a practice. Sometimes it's in response to some pressing tragedy, but I think more often, when liberating one's interior world, I think more often it's about a discipline of seeing the world daily, a daily unmasking. And it's not just sadness. I'm always kind of taken with the fact that the Bible, the prophet Jeremiah, he talks about lament as if it's something that needs to be taught. He has this couplet where he says, teach your daughters a lament, teach your daughters how to wail, which I think is so subversive and strange that lament might actually not be intuitive, that it's something we need to learn and practice. When I have encountered resistance to this, it has a lot to do, I think, with our misconceptions of hope and frankly, the Christian obsession with toxic positivity and, it will all be okay. And we also assume that if a person is grieving or sad, they've lost hope, which I think is a really lazy emotional critique, by the way. I think often we're taught to think about lament as this stepping stone to hope, or this step in the process of healing. And I don't actually think that's true. I think lament itself is a form of hope. I think it's saying, God, you promised. And that we grieve because of an innate sense that this is not the way it's supposed to be. And how could we articulate this is not the way it's supposed to be if we did not, on some plane of soul, have an expectation or hope of what it could be? I say all the time to students at Cornell, true lament, it's not born of that trite sentiment that everything is bad, that the world is terrible. I think it's actually born of a deep conviction that the world is worthy of goodness. People cite this a lot, but when Lazarus died, Christ wept not because of an absence of hope. We wouldn't say this, he was just minutes away from restoring him to life. And would you dare tell him to kind of get on with it? Why are you crying? It's going to all be okay. We wouldn't dare, because Christ wept as an honoring, I think. He wept with the knowledge that death is a tragedy sometimes, and that the goodness of this friendship deserved the honor of naming, this is not good. It is not well in my interior world. Novelist Jesmyn World wrote, but this grief, for all its awful weight, insists that he mattered. Lament, I think, insists on our dignity, insists that we matter. And throughout Scripture, I think we have far more demonstrations of an emotionally disrupted God than a contented one. Freedom does not come by holding your interior world captive. It doesn't. We belong, I think, to a God of whole, embodied, emotional liberation. And I'll say this, I think lament is one of the most compelling apologetics we have, in a time when so many Christians prefer to erase or rush over suffering in a person and kind of promote this strange Christian escapism about going to heaven someday. And an escapism that's, woven into our eschatology and kind of laced with toxic positivity. And I think what has the potential to really strike people is actually witnessing a Christian who sees and names and weeps for the present condition of the world, not as a performance. A Christian who tells the truth about pain and is capable of sitting in that tension without resolve. There is no path to healing apart from the lament of the wound and without beholding the wound. And I think it's good and right to do this habitually, daily, if you can stand it. Now, I hope you hear that's true of your other emotional expressions as well. It's not just true of our lament, but our anger, our fear. I think it's true of our joy. When we reclaim an emotional attunement, an emotional honesty, we remind ourselves that no part of our interior world will be caged. No peace will be chained behind a locked door. Now, sometimes the journey to liberating one's interior world is actually the journey away from spaces of false belonging. So it's not without loss, because the closer you get to your true self, this is what I'm finding at least, the closer you get to your true self, your true emotions, beliefs, the more you will disturb the waters of someone else's false self. And people don't tend to like this, they don't tend to like to be confronted with their false self in the presence of something real. And so I always try to say, that for all of us, the journey to liberating one's interior world is just that. It's a journey, and it takes time. It takes time because there's real grief and real risk and real relationships at stake. The people in your space might not love to see you decolonizing your interior landscape. They might not love to hear what you really believe, about trans lives, about heaven and hell, about your own face. And so I think we can move with both urgency in protection of our true self and in compassion for all of the things that have made us terrified to approach it. So interior liberation, it's a culmination, it's a way of existing, habitual reclamation in a world that obscures us from ourselves. Okay, let's talk about memory and story. About a year before I began writing my book, I was once again kind of rethinking my existence, kind of thinking about what it means to be a Black contemplative, and if that was something that was really true for me, or if it was just a product of kind of whiteness's rewiring of me. And I did what I do anytime I'm not sure who I am. I looked backward, and I started thinking about my ancestors, specifically my ancestors who were enslaved. And it occurred to me that much of their spiritual lives while enslaved was relegated to their interior worlds. They couldn't say what they wanted to say always. They didn't have agency in their bodies, but they did have those sacred, secret spaces, where no master could go. And I realized that Black spirituality in this time survived by the interior worlds of my ancestors. This contemplative work, this interior work, this is in me. This is in Black blood. And I had already begun this personal project, like I said, interviewing different family members and different elders, attempting to preserve some familial storytelling in a family that has very little in the way of artifacts or kind of shared memory. And I was noticing all of these threads between my grandma and my father and myself. And by the time I went to write the first chapter of the book, which by the way wasn't meant to contain family stories, I was just writing a book of Christian contemplation. But by the time I went to write, I couldn't write about dignity without writing about my father greasing our scalps in the morning. Those stories were so awake in me. I couldn't write about lament without writing about my grandma crumpled on the linoleum floor. As I journeyed into their stories in mystery, I found my own selfhood brought into focus. And it wasn't until after I was finishing This Here Flesh, I actually had finished, that I picked up Toni Morrison's The Source of Self-Regard. I highly recommend it. There's an essay in it called The Sight of Memory. And Morrison is talking about this practice of imagination for the interior lives of the people that came before us, Black ancestors. And she was writing in a time where narratives of enslaved people were beginning to show up in fiction more and more. And Morrison's critique was that they were showing up on the page, but completely, emptied of their interior lives. And she was very critical of this. And she talks about this practice, this archaeological practice of the interior, and this practice of imagination for the interior lives of those who came before as a journey into herself. She says this, "And I can't tell you how I felt reading to my grandmother while she was turning over and over in her bed because she was dying and she was not comfortable. But I could try to reconstruct the world that she lived in. Like Frederick Douglass talking about his grandmother, and James Baldwin talking about his father, and Simone de Beauvoir talking about her mother. These people are my access to me. They are my entrance into my own interior life, which is why the images that float around them, the remains, so to speak, at the archaeological site, surface first, and they surface so vividly and so compellingly that I acknowledge them as my route to a reconstruction of a world, to an exploration of an interior life that was not written at least to the revelation of any kind of truth. She says, they are my entrance. So what if the journey of liberating oneself, one's interior world, is not a solitary journey? What if it's born out of those that have come before us, those whose stories rest in us? I think the journey inward is in many ways a mission of time travel. As I wrote this here flesh and excavated those stories of my grandma and father, my own face appeared to me with greater clarity than it ever had before. It's very mysterious. I put down the pen feeling nearer to myself than I ever had before. What are the stories that have made you? Those that happened to you and those that unfolded long before you were even a thought in the mind of creation. Howard Thurman says, who are you? You've got to find out what your name is. And years later, Alice Walker says, how simple a thing it seems that to know ourselves as we are, we must know our mother's names. How simple a thing it seems that to know ourselves as we are, we must know our mother's names. It's becoming increasingly difficult to conceive of my own selfhood apart from those who have made me. So in my work, I talk a lot about contemplative storytelling because I'm convinced that we make sense of our lives and who we are, not primarily through theories and personality tests or even through data. I think primarily we make sense of our lives through story. Through the practice of memory held rightly and being turned over again and again, when it's safe and right. If you want to know what you love, go to a story where you were terrified to lose it. If you want to know what you hunger for, go to a story where you didn't have enough, where what was needed was withheld from you. If you want to know what you're ashamed of, take me to your bathroom mirror. When you're 10 years old and finally tall enough to see yourself. And you don't have to travel alone. Who will journey with you? Who can be trusted to journey with you? Not all are good companions for the journey, but you will need companions. And I say you don't have to open any door before you're ready. I think be patient with yourself, careful. There are stories, there are rooms in you that have been locked for a reason. And I try to consider this, before rushing to pry open any door without a plan for how you're going to receive care afterward. So take your time. It's a lifelong journey into our interior worlds, a daily vow that we will stay near to ourselves. So again, our question, how can nearness to your interior world in all its magic and mystery serve as an active liberation practice? I think you can trust that our attention is being pulled in 100 other places at this point in history. I would suggest we have more access to the chaos and tragedies of the world than ever before. In 2023, with the flick of my thumb, I can flick from great tragedy to great tragedy. Tremendous pain to tremendous pain with very little intention for how I'm going to process or heal or contribute to healing. And this access, for all its good, it can be an interior quicksand. So I want you to hear this, that you cannot care for the world without encountering your own face. I don't survive by your self-ignorance, nor do you mine. I don't survive by your bondage, nor do you mine. And we begin where our ancestors did, in the sacred, hidden interiors, those mysterious corridors of the heart, where we have long hesitated to go. We're gonna have some time for Q&A in a moment, but I'll leave you with this blessing for now. May the one who formed you be your companion as you listen for the sound of the genuine in you. May your true self be freed have its breath restored daily. And may the divine protect you as you travel into the stories that have formed you, that you would enter with all compassion, curiosity, and tenderness. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Now we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Happy to answer any questions about what I've spoken about or about things that I haven't.
I'm happy to bring the mic to those who might raise a hand to have a question expressed. Are there questions for further conversation from what we've heard today? I'm going to do my little Phil Donahue act, if you remember that.
Thank you. My question is about my own personal grieving process, and I like what you said about grief and lamentation and the discovery of the true self. And identity crisis seems to be a part of my grief process, and I've learned that this is natural. May you talk about identity crisis in relation to the true self?
Yeah. I mean, I think grief just does something that changes us. And I'm one of those people who don't believe it's something that you ever really get over. I think you learn how to walk different in the world. You learn how to carry the world differently. And that adjustment to posture, I think it changes everything. It can create an identity crisis, certainly for your own relationship to yourself, but also to the people you love. There are seasons where I've become a stranger to people who love me, and people I love have grieved, and they've become a stranger to me. And you almost have to meet them again and allow for that instead of trying to pull someone back into a former iteration of themselves. I found so much healing and freedom when actually people are just willing to re-meet me and understand that I'm not actually going to go back to the way I was before. And I think I can extend that compassion to myself as well now I need to figure out who the hell I am again, and it takes time after every new grief, I think. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Cole, you've spoken so beautifully about the interplay between true self and false self, and the importance of finding our true selves. And I think you've also pointed to the fact that one of the most insidious things about the false self is the way it can wrap itself around us, and we can become so habituated to it that it becomes to seem to us as our true self, becomes to seem organic. And as we think about all of these practices for kind of retrieving the true self, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the work of discernment, how we discern what the true self is from that false self, and where there might be a false self that is perceived as true.
Yes. It's a very good question. It's true. When Merton says, we're not very good at recognizing illusions, least of which the ones we cherish about ourselves, I find that to be very true. That for some of us, for many of us, we've had to live Mass for so long, it's very difficult to kind of figure out anything else. I think, journeying back for me has been tremendously helpful, journeying back to my childhood. I'm not to say that your childhood self is the truest form of you, but I think it is one form. And there's a point in childhood where you become a little more aware of yourself, for a little more self-conscious, for better and for worse. And I'm really interested in the moment just before that, as 4 or 5-year-old Cole. What was she doing? So I brought in Cole mixing potions in the basement. I wasn't just shy. There was some other thing happening in me that was true. I was very interested in the mystical. But I think that, especially for us adults, that journey backward can be very revealing. Whether that's to find things that are no longer true and were insincere as a childhood, or whether that is to find things that still really resonate. And I think present discernment, I think good company, if you're surrounded by people who kind of feed into the illusions, in you, who, when I was around people that truly only valued the intellect, it was very difficult to conceive of my identity apart from that. Even once I knew that some element of that was a false self, it's very difficult to disengage because my belonging was at stake. And I think that's a very hard thing to ask of someone. But if you find yourselves in spaces of kind of true welcome, that aren't threatened by any one expression in you, I think it becomes a little more easier to do that discernment and to practice that listening. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Hi, Cole. I was really compelled by how you talked about lament as an act of hope rather than something that leads to hope. And I wonder if you can talk maybe just a little bit more granularly about the practice of lament and how that is distinguished from maybe the general feeling of despair that's so easy to feel as you scroll through tragedy to tragedy, as you were talking about earlier. What are some markers of like a practice of lament that is an act of hope?
Yes, yeah. I'll say that I think despair is lament emptied of hope. And I think of about kind of lament as like a room that you can enter and depart as you feel kind of free to do so. And despair kind of depends upon you staying. It does not want you to engage with any other reality in your emotional landscape. And so I try to remember that self. If I'm finding myself feeling very sad, or but it's completely emptied of imagination, then chances are I'm at risk. I'm at risk for the more sinister form of sadness, which is despair. Practically, how I think lament can function in the world, I think a lot of creativity. I mean, I think we can look to artists for this. I'm of course biased that the people I love most in this world are all artists, but I think, they're dreaming up, they have, and they continue to dream up ways for survival in the midst of great tragedy, or artists are able to create out of that. And not out of numbness, not out of a kind of demand for happiness. No poet is going to demand your happiness. They're going to demand your honesty. So I think artists can certainly help us to kind of imagine different practices for lament, whether that's dance, painting, singing, writing. Yeah, I'm inclined to kind of lean in that direction. I think there's probably other ways apart from that. There's a lot of really creative people. I mean, children, I think, could absolutely be our guides into this, Children, before they learn to apologize for their tears, they're like very instinctual, weepers. It's very beautiful the way that they're able to kind of tap in and say, this is not okay. So I think we could also probably put some kids in charge of our lament practices in church and see what happens. Yeah.
I'm back here if you're wondering where the mic is. Okay. Other questions or things people might want to offer or
There's
ask?
one up here.
I need those hands held high. Got it.
So you talked about emotional repression as being generational. I'm wondering then, does that mean that emotional freedom is also generational? And is that generational at an individual level or at a communal level?
I think both. I do think that you can inherit, like, emotional freedom. You can. Like, I think that there... Yeah. I'm thinking of... well, actually, I won't say his name, a poet I was in community with last night at an event, and him just talking to me about his relationship with his daughter, and how he's trying to help her to kind of put some of her interior world on a page right now through journaling. And I think it's absolutely positive, and he was getting quite emotional, and which I think is beautiful. And I think it's very possible for parents to kind of model this for their children. But it's hard. It's hard to both model it and welcome it in another. I think some of us are very good at modeling it, but not as good at receiving it when a children begins to mirror back true emotion. Because especially, for a number of reasons, but it can be very well-meaning in as much as you want your child's pain to resolve. You'll do whatever it takes for your child's pain to resolve, when sometimes they actually just need the patience and the kind of glory of time. So I think it is something that can be inherited. I think of my grandma, and she certainly was in resistance. My dad's stoicism. My grandma wasn't very articulate about her emotions, but she displayed them. And I was learning from that, even if I was feeling a kind of guilt and shame from other places. Yeah. And did you ask a second part of your question? Yes. It almost has to be, doesn't it? Because if you can only practice it with one person, how free are you? I think you do need a bit of a community around it. And a community that says, I don't need to feel the exact same thing as you in order for it to be real to me. I think liturgy... I'm a liturgist, so I'm biased, but I think liturgy can do this for you Episcopal folks. It has the capacity to be this beautiful kind of practice of solidarity, emotional solidarity. What does it mean to stay in the words, even if they don't resonate with you, even if they're not for you, to kind of stay in the room with the feeling and speak the words as your own, even if they're not yours. I think that is kind of beautiful, communal, emotional solidarity, if we let it be. So yeah, definitely something that should be practiced in community. Now, are all communities capable of holding all emotions? I don't know. Go where it's safe. Amani Perry, she's a Black writer, and she says, you don't tell all the secrets when you're trying to get free, and kind of warns of that, of you don't have to give away too much of yourself if it's not a safe. Safe is kind of a overused sentiment right now, but truly safe place. You don't have to give away too much. Are there other questions in the room?
I just wanted to say, as one who does a lot of blessings, your blessing was pretty fantastic. And can we get a copy of that? I couldn't write it down fast enough.
Yes.
Thank you.
I would be happy to send a copy. Yeah, happy to do that.
Any others? Yes. Yeah, we'll come out.
Hi, Cole. I just wanted to ask you what you're talking about with excavating stories and doing archaeological reconstruction of interior life. This is very countercultural in our very quick, fast-paced, phone-driven kind of culture. And how would you recommend that families and people make space to come together to have this kind of thing happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is very kind of increasingly countercultural. It didn't used to be, right? The storytelling and the circles and the dinner table used to really have some potential, and some of that's been deflated. I think, so I started interviewing elders in my family as kind of a personal project. It was before I knew I was going to write a book, and it was because I was feeling so jealous of specifically my spouse, whose family has so much history. They have shelves and, a room of diaries and journals and all of these beautiful artifacts that preserve their story. And my family had nothing. We have no artifacts, or at least very little in terms of something you would pass on. And I tried to kind of articulate this grief to my grandma, this jealousy, and she almost didn't understand it. You know, she didn't really think she had anything of value in terms of a physical artifact. And so I began the kind of long journey of trying to convince her that at the very least her stories, you know, can be an inheritance. And so I think I learned as I was interviewing my grandma and my father first that I had to learn how to ask a question again. You know, my ability to ask a good question was completely atrophied. You know, I went into it thinking, yeah, I'm going to interview them, and the first kind of round, it was terrible. None of those answers are in the book, that's for sure. Because I was asking such shallow questions, and they were shallow because they were so broad. And I found that when I learned to kind of zero in on the particularity of their stories and say, I'm actually just interested in like the grand narrative of your life. I don't need that right now, but I want to know about, I want you to take me to your mirror, Grandma, when you were 10 years old, and it doesn't need to resolve. So I think a lot of that relies on us being able to ask better questions and convincing one another that we will wait with each other for the answer to the stories, that we can bear the stories, that we learn how to become kind of trusted story bearers, because a lot of time our elders are kind of glossing over things, thinking we want resolution or a lesson, when really we just want to meet them in a new way. So yes, lots of better question asking, better story holding. Thank you for that question. There's someone right here, Bishop Jennifer.
Hi, Cole. Thank you.
Hi.
A lot of the work that I am currently doing has to do with finding out narratives and how sometimes the narratives that either oppress us or liberate us have many consequences, many symptoms, right? And when I look at myself and look at things that I want to liberate in myself, I see a symptom, something, for instance, like I dislike something in my body, for instance. But the reality is that the problem is not my body. The reality is there is a narrative that is playing in my heart, in my mind, and that's what needs to be liberated. And I am wondering, since you explained so beautifully about the interior liberation, is there a metaphor for the church that you could see between the interior liberation of one being and the interior liberation of a church that has so many complicated narratives and that right now is trying to heal symptoms that actually point at those narratives?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I've not been asked this question, so it sounds like you're kind of asking about like the interior work of an institution, specifically the church. Fascinating. You know, I like this idea. I'll be thinking about this probably for the rest of the day, and I do think it's possible. I don't have another metaphor for it, but I think it's a question worth asking. If we do this on a kind of personal level, for lack of a better word, if we do this, then can it transcend into on an institutional level and lead to some kind of interior, some kind of interrogation, really, of a collective interior? I think that's possible. So I'm comparing it to kind of some thinking I've done on the collective interior self that was inspired by kind of Toni Morrison's work of like, can there be a collective interior world shared among people? And I think your question is kind of like, can there be a collective interior world shared among a church? And I think there can be. There's this practice, I thought about leading you through it today, but it would have been really difficult to do in your pews, the way you're sitting. But there's a practice I do called interior landscaping. I've done it with people where I have people either draw a map of a place if they're very more literal, or if they're feeling more abstract, I'll have them draw a map of their own interior world. And I kind of ask some questions as we meditate with some Visio Divina on that map. I'll ask questions about loves, fears, different sites that exist on the map. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I think that would be an interesting thing to do as a church. Could you make a map of a church building, the very physical space, and start mapping out these different sites, a desert, a place where there's need and thirst, a well, a place where that's met, a table, and could you map out some stories in metaphorically and literally onto the site? And I think spending time with whatever you create could be a really beautiful kind of practice to explore the interior of the collective. Yeah. Anyways, that was a long answer, but thank you for that question. Very thoughtful.
We have time for one last question. I think we're here.
You talk about the importance of stories from elders. Could you comment on the role that dementia has in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A few people in my family struggle with their memory. And my grandma, at the end of her days, she passed just before the book was published, a few months, was struggling to retain some of her memory. And she talked about the loneliness of that, the loneliness of not feeling like you have possession of the things that you've lived. So anyways, I'm sympathetic to it. And I think it's, well, I'll say how I think about it, but I'll talk to you later. I want to hear what you think. I think that there are some things, memories, that survive in the body without articulation, and that there can be beauty in this. And, I've spent a lot of time talking about kind of the cognitive exploration of those memories, but I think there can be a recognition that there are things that have come and gone that we will never know, that exist in our DNA, so to speak. There's research about this now, about the things you inherit and how they kind of rest in your genes. So I'd like to think that some amount of memory exists in the body, even if we can't articulate it, and we can honor that. And I also like to think, my grandma would say that we need other people to hold our memories for us. And I always found that really beautiful, that she would say, the truest memory so rarely survives, but like, who's holding it with me? And can that make it more true in some way? And I think that's kind of, anyways, I started with her loneliness because I actually think that exploration of memory and community can kind of be an antidote to some of the alienation that comes when one's losing some of their memory. Yeah. Thank you for that question. And thank you everyone for listening. It's great to be in this space.
Thank you.